Great, thank you. And yeah, this has been an amazing opportunity, me being quite new here at SIAT. I started in November to just start to hear all the different research that's happening within the institution. It's been great. So for today, what I wanted to do was to introduce you to the Imaginative Methods Lab that myself and colleague Frederick Lesage, who's an associate professor also here at SFU in the School of Communication, are currently setting up at SIAT. And so the lab effectively will be a space for designing tools for more critical and public imagination, and really builds off the work that we've been doing as part of what we used to call the Defamiliarization Studio over the past 10 years. And so what we mean by imaginative methods is not a call for some kind of imagineering of research, but rather it entails a setting out to develop and share ways to do research otherwise. So Fred and I really understand the imagination as methodology itself, and so as something that is not situated in the mind, but is instead fundamentally part of a material intervention in the world. And our work is really driven by a desire to kind of work with people as a means to kind of collectively rethink the present, to apprehend the unknown, or to kind of tease out some of the taken for granted in our world, and as a means to challenge systems of power, privilege, and authority. So in short, the lab is not just about designing better research methods, but it's about setting out to fundamentally reimagine how research can help us think and not know with others. And so it's not really that our methods are in and of themselves imaginative, but that through their enactments, they invite people to imagine. And so, it's kind of into this space, to invite them into a space of imagining. And so for the next 9 minutes, I wanted to briefly talk you through a project I recently did with one of our collaborators, Dr. Danny Admis, to give you an example of how imaginative methods can be used in this particular instance to help a museum reimagine the role of interpretation by also teasing out kind of the power of interpretational politics, where not only the norms of interpretation, but also the structure of knowledge and research fundamentally overdetermine what can be done, kind of the possibilities for action. And so in 2019, we were approached by the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology, MAT, in Lisbon, Portugal, and they were familiar with some of the work we had been doing in Helsinki and Porto around the politics of interpretation, kind of particularly in relation to museums and ocean conservation. They invited us to work with them as part of their recent initiative, which was to question the role of cultural institutions in society and to prototype the future of their own museum. So what we were particularly interested in was thinking the museum as a type of construct that kind of sees the division of culture as a separate entity from the natural world, a concept which is held in place through their tactics of categorization, organization, and interpretation. So we believe these types of constructs are no longer convincing in the new climate regime, which needs new narratives that go beyond this kind of separation of nature and culture, which is what we were ultimately kind of hoping to trouble in this project. So early on in the project, we identified a local marine protected area, and so we still really wanted to work with this idea of interpretation, but within the context of ocean conservation. And so we located this sort of local marine protected area that sat virtually on the doorstep of MAT, and this became kind of the focus of the research. And so this is the Avancas. You can kind of see it in the slide here. It's the red part mapped out in this metropolitan map of Lisbon. And for those of you kind of unfamiliar with an MPA is kind of enshrined as a sovereign site designated for the protection of aquatic species and ecosystems. And it does this through the gesture of creating these kind of bounded areas, essentially limiting or stopping outright human interventions in the form of extraction, fishing, sort of local tourism activities, so on and so forth. And so we were really interested in the fact that many things pass into this apparently impermeable space. Bodies of water are constantly in flux and do not abide by these invisible boundaries. And many of the challenges plaguing our oceans stem from realities of acidification, rising temperatures, and contaminants like microplastics that not only follow the tides, but are intimately connected to our everyday human behaviors on land. And so we really wanted to see how do you get people to kind of see that they too are connected to these spaces, that their actions are implicated in this notion of marine protection. So because there were no easy kind of ethical answers, the project was devised as a collective process of figuring out how to work with what we call kind of tactics of storying otherwise, which really fundamentally relies on the recognition that all we are the stories we tell. And so in the end, what we did was we effectively designed this fictional interpretation center for the Avancas MPA, and we housed it in MAT. And through the work, what we wanted to do was to kind of question what an interpretation center could be, what stories it might need to tell, and how it should tell these stories as a way to think through the possibilities of approaching interpretation as a critical device for unveiling invisible structures in our world. But also kind of to use the space to engage visitors to reflect on their own relations to this local MPA specifically. So what we did is we worked with marine scientists, conservationists, fishermen, and locals to design a series of interpretation exhibits, which were effectively inspired by normative forms of exhibits that you would expect to find in a typical interpretation center, but reimagined in relation to other frameworks such as feminist epistemology and queer ecology to raise the question of what happens when we tell other stories of these spaces. What possibilities do they bring forward for public understanding and action? So the first display, which you can see here, was entitled "What is an MPA?" and offered a description of marine protected zones presented as an expanded timeline of their development. So it began with kind of pre-colonial age and ended in 2020. And the aim was to enliven histories of ecological conservation while using the trope of a timeline to unveil some of the complexities, underlying structures, values, and politics of an MPA. So our timeline brought together kind of varied histories of aquatic conservation, aquaculture, marine biodiversity tracking and monitoring, marine popular culture, and plastics, as well as the effect plastic pollution has had on waste and health. And the point of including these kind of separate but related timelines in our definition was to show that A, the evolution of tools that allowed marine biodiversity tracking and monitoring move forward an understanding of what is, and by extension what needs to be, protected in our oceans. 2, that the watershed moments in popular culture changed public awareness of marine biodiversity, leading to greater ecological action. And 3, that international laws, acts, and systems of marine management really demonstrate what was most valued about the ocean at different points in history, sort of as resource, recreation, and/or spiritual value. With this particular exhibit, we really wanted to redefine what an MPA was, not simply as the site of conservation and protection, but also as an object of a social challenge. So to tease out this idea that to conserve and protect these designated areas ultimately requires the unmaking and remaking of our social worlds. So this was a second display, which was a food web of intertidal rocky shore habitat, which included within it plastics and other chemical pollutants abundant in the local marine ecosystem. So we began with the question, if animals eat microscopic particles of pollution, is this part of the food web? The decision to include micropolluting chemicals into the Avanca's food web was to prompt a broader question about how we think about organisms being affected by anthropogenic climate change. So a third display, there we go. Okay, a third display was called Strange Strangers, and it was sort of inspired by Timothy Morton's notion of the strange stranger, which he believes is sort of not only strange, but strangely so. So they could be us, they are us. And part of Morton's argument is that we need new ways to reimagine nature and our relations with and within it, to kind of think ecologically as a means to develop a politicized intimacy with other beings and non-beings alike. And so part of this exhibit was sort of a test case for how we might build empathy and reconnect with the ocean through the lens of personality types, and was really built off some of the school programs that were being sort of pushed through in the sort of it was about K-8 system in Lisbon at the time. And so what we did is we chose to kind of tell the story of a small selection of marine inhabitants of the Avancas through their personality traits in hopes of kind of confronting ourselves with the familiarity yet strangeness of what lies beneath the ocean. And so this particular exhibit kind of invited visitors to sort of find their marine archetype and then take away the corresponding postcard, which gave more information about the species and its role in ocean ecology. And so you can sort of see here, if you kind of follow one of your things, so I can blend into any environment, brings you to the common octopus, which then says, so the common octopus is an independent, intelligent, and creative freethinker. These thoughtful architects seek to understand the world by using intelligence and analytical skills. People with this marine archetype know how to get what they want. Skilled at hacking anything life throws their way, common octopi are flexible and agile, quick thinking and strategic. These gifted problem solvers are most comfortable away from the spotlight and are often said to be clueless in romance. And so this was sort of a nod to the fact that female octopi are known to strangle their male counterparts after mating. And so altogether, the exhibits sort of aim to articulate some of the absent concerns and entangled complexities that produce the contemporary space of the Avancas, so that we could collectively cultivate a renewed conservation imagination and ultimately find ways to better care with an MPA. So as part of the Fictional Interpretation Center, we also devised an outreach program which included a series of workshops with marine scientists and local publics to explore civic conservation initiatives. And in these workshops, we used the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a departure point to begin to think through what it would mean to enshrine the rights and freedoms of all organisms of the ocean. And this was an attempt to kind of collectively think about a shared responsibility to the ocean and to speculate what types of futures might come from a deep respect and interconnection between human beings and the sea. And with this activity, we were not trying to suggest that we assign personhood to the ocean, but rather to see what possibilities we might uncover if we were to take the notion of rights and apply it to this life-giving and life-supporting ecosystem. And so this part came through in the second stage of the workshop, where participants envisioned kind of future jobs and daily acts that they might do in order to uphold the rights that were imagined. And so together the workshops themselves culminated into a crowdsourced Declaration of Ocean Rights that was later translated into a further exhibit in the Interpretation Center. And so with this type of work, what we were doing in the lab is really about working with individuals, communities, and organizations across the world to kind of design methods and tools to collectively reimagine the world in order to open up new possibilities for insight and social change. And as part of the work, we're exploring kind of how do we build a deeper democracy of the imagination to fully encounter research as a collective endeavor, while building critical and creative tools for kind of thinking and acting in times of crisis. Thank you.